Hello everyone, and welcome back. Tonight's story takes us into a world where medicine and mystery once walked hand in hand. When doctors used leeches for everything, even love problems. Before we begin today's video, I could really use your help. We've noticed the channel's reach has dipped a little, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, completely free, and it helps us carry on bringing you new and fascinating stories. Your support truly means the world to us, and together we can keep this channel growing. Thank you ever so much. Now, let's get on with today's story. And please, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to see people joining from all over the world. So, dim the lights, maybe turn on a quiet fan for that soft background hum, and settle in. Let's take a slow, strange journey into the medical past. I was 17 when I first entered Dr. Hardwick's surgery, and the smell that greeted me there, that particular mingling of carbolic soap, damp linen, and something darker, something metallic and alive, would remain in my nostrils for the remainder of my days. It was the spring of 1837, though the room knew nothing of seasons. The windows faced north, as all proper surgeries did, admitting a cold, even light that rendered every instrument and surface with an almost judicial clarity. My father had arranged the apprenticeship with considerable pride. Dr. Hardwick was not merely respected, but revered throughout Whitechapel and beyond. He had studied at Guy's Hospital, had attended lectures by Astley Cooper himself, and possessed a collection of anatomical drawings that physicians came from as far as Bath to examine. More than this, he was known as a man of principle, who would treat a labourer's child with the same grave attention he afforded a merchant's wife, though of course the fees differed according to station. The surgery occupied the ground floor of a handsome townhouse on Wentworth Street. You entered through a black-painted door with a brass plate so polished you could see your face distorted in its surface. The waiting room was papered in a dark green that absorbed what little light the single window offered, and furnished with 6 straight-backed chairs that no one ever seemed comfortable upon. Patients sat with their hands folded, their eyes fixed on the turkey carpet, as though the very act of waiting were itself a kind of treatment, a disciplining of the body's demands. Beyond this room lay the surgery proper, and it was here that my true education began. The chamber was dominated by a long table of oak, its surface worn smooth by decades of use and scrubbed daily with lye soap until the grains stood out like the lines upon an aged hand. Against the eastern wall stood the cabinets, tall cases of dark wood with glass doors, behind which gleamed the instruments of our profession. Lancets in their velvet-lined cases, their blades catching the light like small prayers, scarificators with their spring-loaded teeth, pewter-bleeding bowls, sized from teacup to basin, brass syringes, porcelain cupping vessels, and row upon row of bottles containing powders and tinctures whose names I would learn to recite in my sleep: calomel, jalap, antimony, laudanum, spirits of hartshorn. But it was the leech jars that held my attention that first morning. They lined an entire shelf, perhaps 20 jars in all, each one a cylinder of heavy glass, stoppered with perforated cork. Inside, the water was cloudy, greenish, and in constant subtle motion. At first I could not make out the creatures themselves. Then Dr. Hardwick lifted one of the jars and held it to the window, and I saw them. Dark ribbons curling and uncurling against the glass, their bodies contracting and extending with a kind of blind purposefulness that made my stomach tighten. "Hirudo medicinalis, Doctor," Hardwick said, his voice carrying that particular satisfaction of a man introducing a pupil to a fundamental truth. The medicinal leech. Observe the 3 jaws, each bearing approximately 100 teeth. When properly applied, they will draw between 20 and 40 millilitres of what the body cannot hold. The ancients understood what we are only now confirming through proper study, that plethora is the root of most suffering, and depletion is its remedy. He returned the jar to its place with a gentleness that bordered on reverence. "You will learn to keep them," he continued. "They require fresh water twice weekly. River water is best, never from the well. They must be kept cool but not cold. Too warm and they grow sluggish, refuse to feed. Too cold and they perish. You will come to know each jar's temperament. Some are eager, others must be coaxed. The art lies not merely in the application, but in the selection of the creature itself. I nodded, though in truth I understood very little. I had thought medicine was a matter of knowledge, of learning which powder relieved which symptom, which posture indicated which inner corruption. I had not understood that it would require this strange husbandry, this intimate acquaintance with creatures that seemed to exist in some realm between the medicinal and the monstrous. That first week I was given no patients to observe. Instead, I cleaned. I scrubbed the oak table until my hands were raw. I polished the brass until I could see the surgery reflected in miniature upon each instrument. I washed the windows with vinegar and old newspaper until the northern light fell through them like a blessing. And I learned to tend the leeches. Twice weekly, as instructed, I would empty each jar into a basin, carefully avoiding contact with the creatures themselves, though once or twice they would fix upon my hand with a grip that was at once gentle and utterly immovable. The sensation was not painful, but deeply unsettling, as though something were reading my pulse, learning the rhythm of what sustained me. I would have to slide a fingernail beneath the creature's head and pry it loose, then drop it quickly into its waiting jar of fresh water. Dr. Hardwick watched these early attempts with an expression I could not read. Was it amusement? Assessment? Some private memory of his own apprenticeship, decades past? "They know the quality of what they taste," he said once, as I struggled to detach a particularly determined specimen from my thumb. "A healthy body repels them. They seek corruption, fever, the thickened flow that speaks of inner excess. Your vigour offends them, which is why they release so readily." I did not feel vigorous. I felt clumsy and ignorant and faintly nauseated, but I learned. By the second week I was permitted to observe treatments. The surgery received patients between the hours of 9 and 12 in the morning, and again from 2 until 5 in the afternoon. They came with complaints both ordinary and strange. A woman whose monthly courses had ceased, causing a dangerous accumulation that manifested as headaches and melancholia. A boy of 11 whose chest whistled with each breath, the fever having settled in his lungs. A merchant whose gout had become so severe he could no longer wear a boot upon his left foot. A young woman, barely older than myself, who trembled constantly and could not meet anyone's gaze. For each of them, Dr. Hardwick would conduct his examination with the same methodical care. He would study the tongue, feel the pulse at wrist and throat, press his fingertips beneath the jaw to assess the humours. He would ask questions in a voice that was neither kind nor unkind, but simply certain, and the patients would answer with a particular honesty that fear and respect together produce, and for most of them, the treatment would involve depletion. The woman whose courses had ceased was bled from the ankle with a lancet, 8 ounces drawn into a pewter bowl while she reclined upon the table, her face turned towards the window. Dr. Hardwick counted the seconds beneath his breath, his fingers upon her pulse, monitoring the gradual restoration of balance. When he judged sufficient had been released, he pressed a pad of clean linen to the wound and bound it tightly. "You will feel faint for the remainder of the day," he told her. "Tomorrow the weight behind your eyes will have eased. Continue with the compound tonic, 1 spoonful before bed. Return in a fortnight if the headaches persist." She thanked him with such fervent gratitude that I felt I was witnessing something almost sacred. The boy with the whistling chest received the leeches, 6 of them, applied to his back in 2 rows while he lay face down upon the table, his small body rigid with fear and determination. Dr. Hardwick selected each creature with care, testing its eagerness against his own palm before placing it upon the child's skin. Some attached immediately. Others required coaxing, a gentle pressure, a patient waiting. "Do not move," Dr. Hardwick murmured. "The sensation may trouble you, but you must remain still. They are drawing out the fever. You are being made clean." I watched as the leeches swelled, their bodies darkening and thickening as they fed. The boy's mother stood in the corner, her handkerchief pressed to her mouth, her eyes fixed upon some distant point beyond the surgery walls. The room was utterly quiet, save for the ticking of the mantel clock and the small wet sounds of the creatures at their work. After 20 minutes, Dr. Hardwick began to remove them. Each leech was persuaded to release its grip, then dropped into a jar of salt water, where it would void what it had taken. The wounds continued to seep, which Dr. Hardwick explained was entirely proper. The flow must continue for some hours. It is the body's own completion of the purging. He dressed each wound with a pad of lint and sent the boy home with instructions for his mother to keep the dressings clean and to return immediately if the fever climbed rather than fell. "Will he recover?" I asked after they had gone. "If the corruption has not spread too deeply," Dr. Hardwick replied. "If it has, no amount of depletion will restore him. We can only remove what gathers. We cannot undo what has already taken root." It was the first time I understood that medicine was not the certainty I had imagined. We treated, and then we waited, and sometimes the waiting revealed our insufficiency. The merchant with the gout received both leeches and cupping, the heated glass vessels placed upon his lower back, while leeches drew from the inflamed joint of his great toe. He bore this treatment with a stoicism that seemed almost rehearsed, as though suffering in Dr. Hardwick's surgery were a mark of social standing, proof of one's ability to afford proper care. But it was the young woman who trembled that troubled me most. She was perhaps 19, dressed in the modest but respectable fashion of a tradesman's daughter. Her name was Miss Clara Benson, and she had been brought by her father, a printer whose hands were permanently stained with ink. She could not sit still. Her fingers plucked at her skirts. Her eyes moved constantly about the room, never settling. When Dr. Hardwick asked what ailed her, it was her father who answered. "She will not eat properly. She cannot sleep. She weeps for no cause. The minister says it is a weakness of faith, but I believe it is something deeper, something in the constitution itself." Dr. Hardwick conducted his examination, pulse too rapid, tongue pale, a fluttering in the throat that he measured with his fingertips. When he asked Miss Benson if she felt any particular distress, she looked at her father, then away, then whispered something I could not hear. "A nervous affliction," Dr. Hardwick pronounced, "the result of excessive sensibility compounded by a plethoric tendency. The accumulation of unspent vital force has created an agitation of the entire system." I did not understand what this meant, but Miss Benson's father nodded gravely. The treatment was leeches, applied to the temples and behind the ears. Miss Benson closed her eyes as each creature was placed, and 2 tears ran down her cheeks, though she made no sound. I found myself counting her breaths, matching my own to hers, as though I might somehow steady her through sympathy alone. When the leeches had fed and been removed, Dr. Hardwick prescribed a sedative tincture and strict instructions. No novels, no stimulating company, no music after sunset. She was to walk daily but avoid exertion. She was to occupy herself with plain sewing or other quiet tasks, suitable to her sex. The mind must be calmed, he explained to her father. Excitement depletes the already exhausted reserves. She must be kept tranquil until the balance is restored. After they left, I found myself staring at the 4 small wounds behind where Miss Benson's ears had been, marked now only by spots of darkness on the linen pads we had given her to press against her skin. "Did we help her?" I asked. Dr. Hardwick was cleaning the lancet, drawing the blade across a leather strop with careful, even strokes. He did not look at me when he answered. "We have reduced the internal pressure. Whether that addresses the root cause remains to be seen. The nervous ailments of young women are among the most persistent and least understood afflictions we encounter. Their constitutions are inherently unstable, their humours subject to disruptions we can observe but rarely cure. We do what we can. We deplete what has accumulated beyond bearing. Sometimes that is sufficient." I wanted to ask what happened when it was not sufficient, but something in his tone discouraged further inquiry. That night, in the small room I rented above a tobacconist's shop 3 streets away, I could not sleep. I kept seeing Miss Benson's face, the way her eyes had moved about the surgery, like a trapped bird seeking escape. I kept thinking about the leeches behind her ears, drawing out what Dr. Hardwick called plethora, but what I suspected might simply be unhappiness, fear, some inner ache that had no name beyond the diagnostic vocabulary we imposed upon it. Was it truly excess that made her tremble, or absence? But I was only an apprentice. What did I know of such things? The weeks accumulated into months. Summer came, turning the surgery into an oven despite the northern windows. The leeches grew sluggish, and Dr. Hardwick kept them in the cellar where the temperature remained bearable. I learned to recognize the subtle differences between creatures, which were eager feeders, which required coaxing, which had grown too old and must be retired to the garden pond behind the house. I learned to apply them with confidence, to feel the moment of attachment, to judge when they had drawn sufficient and should be removed. I learned the geography of the body, where to place them for greatest effect, the temples for headaches, the abdomen for digestive complaints, the chest for respiratory infections, the legs for disorders of the womb, behind the ears for nervous agitation. I learned to bleed with a lancet, to find the vein at the inner elbow, to draw the blade across in one smooth motion, to catch what flowed into the pewter bowl while monitoring the patient's pulse for the precise moment when balance had been restored. I learned that 8 ounces was standard, 12 for robust constitutions, 20 for the dangerous fevers that sometimes swept through the rookeries, leaving entire families hollowed out with inner corruption. I learned to cup, heating the glass vessels over the lamp, pressing them to the skin and allowing the cooling air to draw the flesh upward, creating a vacuum that would pull the internal excesses toward the surface, where they could be released through scarification or the more gentle persuasion of leeches. I learned to recognize the signs that required urgent depletion, the bounding pulse, the flushed face, the eyes that were too bright, the complaints of pressure behind the breastbone, the sense of inner fullness that patients described as though they were vessels filled beyond capacity and in danger of rupture. And I learned that nearly every ailment we encountered was attributed to some form of accumulation, some excess that the body in its wisdom sought to expel but could not manage without our intervention. Fever, a plethora of heat that must be drawn off through the skin. Melancholia, a surfeit of black bile that thickened the flow and darkened the spirits. Palpitations of the heart, an excess of vital force with insufficient outlet. The cough that would not quiet, corruption settling in the lungs that must be depleted before it could take permanent root. The monthly courses that came too heavily or not at all, imbalance requiring correction through careful depletion at ankle or inner thigh. Even love, when it became too intense, too consuming, was treated as a kind of fever. I saw 3 cases that first year alone, young women whose attachment to unsuitable men had manifested as physical symptoms. Sleeplessness, loss of appetite, palpitations, fainting spells. Dr. Hardwick treated them all with the same grave attention he afforded every patient. Leeches to reduce the nervous agitation, bloodletting to calm the overexcited circulation, sedative draughts to quiet the mind's unhealthy preoccupation. The heart, he told me once, is subject to the same laws of balance as any other organ. When affection exceeds what can be borne or expressed appropriately, it becomes a pathology. We cannot cure love, but we can moderate its effects until reason reasserts itself. I thought of Miss Benson and wondered whether she had loved unsuitably, whether the trembling had been passion constrained beyond endurance, whether we had bled the longing from her, or only made her too weak to feel it. She returned once, 6 weeks after her first treatment. The trembling had eased, her father reported, though she remained melancholic and withdrawn. Dr. Hardwick prescribed another course of leeches, fewer this time, and a tonic containing iron and gentian to restore her strength. "Will she marry?" her father asked, and I heard in his voice something beyond medical concern. "In time," Dr. Hardwick replied. "When the balance is fully restored, the agitation must be entirely resolved before she undertakes the duties of matrimony. The married state requires considerable nervous stamina in a young woman." Miss Benson said nothing. She looked at the floor while the leeches fed behind her ears, and when she left, she thanked Dr. Hardwick in a voice so soft I barely heard it. I never saw her again. Autumn arrived, and with it the season of respiratory complaints. The surgery filled with coughing, wheezing, the sound of lungs labouring against the corruption that had settled in them. We treated dozens of cases with leeches to the chest, cupping to the back, and when these proved insufficient, bloodletting from the arm in quantities that left patients pale and shaking, but, we were told, improved. Some did improve, others did not. The boy with the whistling chest returned 3 times, each treatment more aggressive than the last. until finally his mother came alone to tell us he had achieved the final quiet in his sleep. Dr. Hardwick noted the case in his ledger with no more emotion than he noted successful treatments. Success and failure were both data, both contributions to the accumulated understanding of our profession. "You must not allow sentiment to cloud your practice," he told me when he saw my face. "We treat what presents itself according to established principles. We cannot predict every outcome. The body has its own will, its own wisdom. Sometimes that wisdom is to release the spirit when the vessel can no longer sustain it." I nodded, but privately I wondered whether we had hastened that release, whether the third round of leeches, the 12 ounces drawn from his thin arm, had been treatment or something else. Something we did not have a name for because we believed so completely in the righteousness of our methods. Winter came. The surgery grew cold despite the fire kept burning in the grate. The leeches became torpid, and Dr. Hardwick ordered fewer of them, relying more on the lancet and cupping. The patients continued to come, bundled against the wind, their complaints unchanged by season. Headaches, swellings, fevers, nervous agitations, disorders of the monthly functions, the mysterious pains that had no visible source, but were nonetheless treated as evidence of internal excess. I was 19 now, no longer truly an apprentice, but not yet a practitioner. Dr. Hardwick began to entrust me with simpler cases. A clerk with recurring headaches whom I bled 8 ounces and sent home with instructions for cold compresses. A woman whose ankles had swollen, treated with leeches to draw off the excess fluid. A child with a fever I managed with cupping and a mild purgative. I began to feel the satisfaction of practice, the sense that I was learning to read the body's signals, to intervene appropriately, to restore what had been thrown into disorder. When patients returned to report improvement, I felt a quiet pride. When they did not return at all, I chose to believe they had been cured. But there were moments, brief and usually in the evening after the surgery had closed and I was alone with the leech jars and the clean instruments, when doubt crept in like a draught beneath a door. Had we truly helped the boy with the whistling chest, or had we weakened him beyond recovery? Had Miss Benson's trembling been cured, or merely suppressed beneath a fatigue too profound for feeling? When we bled a fever, were we removing corruption, or simply removing the body's own attempt to fight what afflicted it? These thoughts were dangerous, I knew. They suggested a lack of faith in methods that had been practiced for centuries, that had been taught by the finest minds in London, that were supported by theory and observation, and the testimony of countless patients who reported feeling lighter, clearer, more balanced after treatment. Who was I to question Dr. Hardwick, who had studied under the great men of Guy's Hospital? Who was I to doubt what Galen himself had understood 2,000 years before, that health was balance, that illness was excess, that the physician's role was to restore equilibrium through judicious depletion? I pushed the doubts away and focused on my work. By my 20th year, I had become quite skilled. I could apply leeches with the confidence of long practice. I could bleed to precisely the right quantity without error. I could read the pulse and the tongue and the subtle signs that indicated which treatment was required. Dr. Hardwick began to speak of partnership, of adding my name to the brass plate beside the door. But then came the case that changed everything. Her name was Mrs. Elizabeth Ashford, and she was 24 years old. She came to us in late March of 1840, accompanied by her husband, a prosperous wool merchant whose concern for her was evident in every gesture. She had been suffering, he explained, from severe headaches and a pressing sensation in her chest that made breathing difficult. She had been seen by 2 other physicians, both of whom had prescribed depletion, but the symptoms had only worsened. Dr. Hardwick examined her thoroughly. Her pulse was indeed rapid, her face flushed. She complained of feeling as though her heart were beating against a great weight, as though something was sitting upon her chest preventing the full expansion of her lungs. When asked if she had any other concerns, she hesitated, then mentioned that her monthly courses had always been difficult but had recently become unbearable, the cramping so severe she could not leave her bed. A clear case of plethora, Dr. Hardwick pronounced. The accumulation of vital force has created pressure throughout the system. The previous treatments were correct in principle, but insufficient in degree. We must be more decisive. He prescribed an aggressive course, 20 ounces to be drawn from the arm immediately, followed by 12 leeches applied to the temples and chest, to be repeated in 3 days if the symptoms persisted. Additionally, a strong purgative to clear the digestive tract and a low diet to prevent any further accumulation. I prepared the instruments while Mrs. Ashford reclined upon the table. Her husband held her hand. She was trembling slightly, but whether from fear or from her complaint, I could not tell. The bloodletting proceeded without incident. 20 ounces filled the pewter bowl, dark and heavy. Mrs. Ashford grew pale, and Dr. Hardwick monitored her pulse throughout, counting beneath his breath. When he judged the correct amount had been released, he bound the wound and had her rest for 30 minutes before applying the leeches. I selected 12 of our most vigorous creatures and placed them as directed, 4 to her temples, 4 to her upper chest, 4 to her abdomen. They attached readily, drawn by whatever they sensed in her circulation. Mrs. Ashford closed her eyes and turned her face away. Her husband whispered something meant to comfort, but his voice carried a tremor. After the leeches had fed and been removed, we dressed the wounds and helped Mrs. Ashford to a sitting position. She was very pale now, and when she tried to stand, she swayed. Her husband caught her, and together we helped her to the chair. "You will feel weak for the remainder of the day," Dr. Hardwick said. "This is expected and indeed desired. The body must adjust to its new balance. Rest completely. Take only beef tea and toast. Return in 3 days." They left, Mr. Ashford supporting his wife with an arm about her waist. Through the window, I watched them make their slow progress to their carriage. 3 days later, a note arrived. Mrs. Ashford was too unwell to travel. The headaches had intensified. The pressure in her chest had become agonizing. Could Dr. Hardwick attend her at home? We went that afternoon, carrying our instruments in the leather case Dr. Hardwick had used throughout his practice. The Ashford house was handsome, on a quiet street in Bloomsbury. We were shown to a bedroom on the first floor where Mrs. Ashford lay propped on pillows, her face the colour of tallow, dark circles beneath her eyes. Dr. Hardwick examined her again. Her pulse was thready now, weak and irregular. Her breathing was shallow. The wounds from the leeches had continued to seep, leaving dark stains on her nightdress. "The depletion has not been sufficient," Dr. Hardwick said. "The corruption runs deeper than I anticipated. We must draw more." Mr. Ashford looked stricken. "More?" But she can barely lift her head. "Which indicates the severity of the plethora," Dr. Hardwick replied. "The weakness is a sign that the internal pressure is overwhelming the vital forces. We must relieve it before the system collapses entirely." He prepared to bleed her again, 12 ounces this time, but when he made the incision, very little came. What did was thin, pale, not the healthy flow that indicated successful depletion. Dr. Hardwick frowned. He applied pressure. A few more ounces trickled out, then stopped altogether. "The vessels are constrained," he muttered. "The body is hoarding what remains. This is grave." He tried cupping, heating the glasses and placing them upon her back. But when he removed them, the marks they left were faint, barely visible. The skin seemed unable to respond. I stood at the foot of the bed, watching, and felt something cold settle in my stomach. This was not treatment. This was something else. Something we did not have a name for because we could not admit what it was. Mrs. Ashford died 3 days later. Mr. Ashford sent word that she had simply grown weaker and weaker until her heart had ceased its labour. The final quiet had come in the early hours of the morning, while he sat beside her holding her hand. Dr. Hardwick received the news with the same composure he showed for all outcomes. He made a note in his ledger. Mrs. Elizabeth Ashford, age 24, severe plethora resistant to treatment, result, expiration. But I could not match his composure. I kept seeing her face, pale as paper, her eyes dull with an exhaustion that went beyond the physical. I kept thinking about the 20 ounces we had drawn, the 12 leeches, the 12 more ounces 3 days later, the desperate cupping that had produced nothing but faint marks on skin too depleted to respond. Had we treated her, or had we hastened the very outcome we claimed to prevent? That night, I did something I had never done before. I went to the medical library at Guy's Hospital, claiming to be conducting research for Dr. Hardwick. I found the text on bloodletting, the authoritative volumes that had guided practice for centuries. I read Galen and Paracelsus, Sydenham and Hunter. I read case reports and treatises, dissertations and observations, and slowly a terrible understanding began to form. The theory was elegant, even beautiful. Balance through depletion, equilibrium through reduction. The body as a vessel that could be kept healthy by preventing overflow. It made sense in the abstract, in the realm of humours and vapours and vital forces. But what if the theory was wrong? What if what we called excess was actually necessity? What if the fever was not something to be depleted, but the body's own mechanism for fighting corruption? What if the rapid pulse was not plethora, but the heart's desperate attempt to circulate what little remained? What if we had been draining away precisely what the body needed to heal itself? I thought of the boy with the whistling chest, growing weaker with each treatment until he had nothing left to sustain the fight. I thought of Miss Benson, bled until her trembling became simple exhaustion. I thought of Mrs. Ashford, depleted beyond recovery while we spoke of balance and restoration. I thought of all the patients who had thanked us for making them feel lighter, clearer, more balanced. Had they actually improved? Or had they simply been too weakened to continue feeling the symptoms we claimed to treat? The doubts I had suppressed for 3 years could no longer be contained. They filled me like a fever, like a plethora of understanding that demanded release. But release into what? If I spoke these doubts aloud, what would happen? Dr. Hardwick would dismiss them as the confusion of insufficient experience. Other physicians would call me naive, ignorant of principles established through centuries of observation. Patients would continue to seek treatment, to demand the depletion they had been taught to expect, that their parents and grandparents had received, that society itself affirmed as proper and necessary. And the leeches would continue to feed, patient and silent, drawing out what we told ourselves they should draw out, what we needed them to draw out, because to admit otherwise would be to admit that we had been practicing not medicine, but a kind of sanctified harm. I returned to the surgery the next morning determined to speak with Dr. Hardwick, but when I entered and saw him preparing for the day's patients, saw him checking the leech jars with the same careful attention he had shown every day for decades, saw him testing the lancet's edge against his thumb, I found I could not form the words. How could I tell this good man, this respected physician, that everything he had dedicated his life to might be wrong, that his care and his precision and his grave attention to his patients' welfare had all been in service of methods that harmed as often as they helped? I could not. The words remained locked inside me, a plethora of doubt with no release. So I continued. I treated patients, I applied leeches, I bled and cupped and prescribed purgatives. I spoke with confidence about balance and depletion, about the wisdom of methods practiced since ancient times. I watched patients grow weaker and called it the necessary cost of restoration. I watched some improve and attributed it to our intervention rather than to their own resilience despite it. But something had changed in me. I began to observe more carefully, to compare outcomes. I noticed that robust patients often improved regardless of treatment, while fragile patients often declined even with the most aggressive intervention. I noticed that the wealthy, who could afford repeated treatments, seemed no healthier than the poor, who could afford only 1 or 2. I noticed that patients who refused treatment, or who could not complete the prescribed course, sometimes recovered just as well as those who submitted fully to our methods. I began to suspect that we were not the agents of healing we claimed to be. That recovery, when it came, was the body's own achievement, often accomplished in spite of our interference rather than because of it. But I said nothing. I was 21 years old, barely qualified, deeply in debt to Dr. Hardwick for my training. I had no standing to challenge methods that had the weight of centuries behind them. I had no evidence beyond my own observations, which could always be dismissed as incomplete, subjective, insufficiently rigorous. So I practiced, and I doubted, and I lived with the tension between them. 2 years passed in this manner. I became a partner in the practice, my name added to the brass plate beside Dr. Hardwick's. We took on an apprentice of our own, a serious boy of 16 who watched the leech jars with the same mixture of fascination and revulsion I had felt at his age. I taught him what I had been taught, perpetuating methods I had come to mistrust, because I did not know what else to do. And then, slowly, things began to change. not in our surgery. Dr. Hardwick maintained his practice exactly as he always had, and I, lacking the courage to break from him, did the same. But in the wider world of medicine, new voices were beginning to speak. Physicians in Paris were conducting statistical studies, comparing outcomes between patients who received bloodletting and those who did not. The results were troubling. No significant difference, and in some cases those who were bled fared worse. In Edinburgh, a young physician named Hughes Bennett was publishing papers questioning the theoretical basis for depletion. In London itself, at the very hospital where Dr. Hardwick had trained, doctors were beginning to reduce the quantities they drew to rely more on observation and less on intervention. The change was subtle at first, a gradual cooling of enthusiasm rather than an outright rejection, but it was happening. The certainties I had been taught were beginning to crack, and through those cracks doubt was seeping into the profession itself. Dr. Hardwick noticed, of course. He read the journals, he attended the lectures, but he did not waver in his practice. Fashion, he would say, when some new paper questioned the value of bloodletting. These young men are eager to make names for themselves by attacking established methods. In 20 years, they will return to the principles their haste led them to abandon. The body's laws do not change with fashion. But what if they were not laws at all? What if they were only theories, elegant and internally consistent, but divorced from the actual mechanics of flesh and circulation? What if we had built an entire edifice of treatment upon foundations that crumbled when examined too closely? I wanted to ask these questions, but Dr. Hardwick's certainty was impermeable. He had practiced for 40 years. He had treated thousands of patients. He had seen outcomes that confirmed his methods to his own satisfaction. No amount of statistical analysis from Paris or theoretical questioning from Edinburgh could shake what experience had taught him to believe. And perhaps he was not entirely wrong, because the truth was more complex than simple rejection or affirmation. Some patients did seem to benefit from bloodletting, particularly those with certain fevers or inflammations. The relief they reported was genuine, even if the mechanism was different from what we supposed. We were not entirely charlatans. We were not deliberately harming. We were practicing according to the best understanding available to us, and if that understanding was flawed, it was nevertheless sincerely held. But sincerity is not the same as correctness, and the harm caused by sincere error is no less real than harm caused by malice. I thought about this often as I continued my work. I thought about Mrs. Ashford and the boy with the whistling chest, and all the others whose names I had forgotten but whose faces remained, pale against the oak table, trusting us to know what they could not know themselves. In the spring of 1845, Dr. Hardwick suffered an apoplexy. He collapsed in the surgery one morning while examining a patient. His face suddenly twisted, his right side rendered useless. I sent for help and attended him as best I could, but even as I loosened his collar and elevated his head, I knew what he would want, what decades of practice had taught him to expect. "Bleed me," he managed to whisper, the words slurred but unmistakable. 20 ounces. The pressure must be relieved. I hesitated. The new thinking, the studies from Paris, suggested that bloodletting after apoplexy could worsen the outcome, that the vessels in the brain were already compromised, and further depletion would only accelerate the damage. But this was Dr. Hardwick, my teacher, my partner, the man who had given me my profession, and he was asking for the treatment he had prescribed to thousands of others, the treatment he believed in with every fibre of his being. I bled him. 20 ounces from his left arm, his good arm, while he lay upon the very table where we had treated so many others. His pulse grew weaker, his breathing became more laboured, but his face showed something like peace, as though the familiar ritual itself provided comfort beyond any physical effect. He died 3 days later, never having regained the use of his right side, never having spoken more than a few garbled words. In his final hours, he squeezed my hand with his good hand, and I chose to believe he was grateful, that he died believing he had been properly cared for according to the principles that had governed his entire life. The funeral was well attended. Patients came, and fellow physicians and representatives from Guy's Hospital. They spoke of his dedication, his skill, his unwavering commitment to the welfare of those who sought his help. No one mentioned that the treatment methods he had championed were falling into disfavour, that a generation of younger physicians was turning away from the lancet and the leech jar. After his death, I inherited the practice. I could have continued exactly as he had done. The surgery was established, the reputation secure. Patients still came expecting the treatments they had always received. The leech jars still lined their shelf, the creatures within still curling and uncurling with their blind, patient hunger. But I could not. The weight of doubt had become too heavy, the accumulation of questions too great for any lancet to release. I began to change the practice, gradually, carefully. I reduced the quantities I drew. I looked for alternative explanations for symptoms, alternative treatments that did not involve depletion. I observed more and intervened less. When patients demanded bloodletting, I gave them smaller amounts than Dr. Hardwick would have prescribed. When they asked for leeches, I applied fewer, and I watched closely to see if the reduction made any difference to their outcomes. And what I discovered was both troubling and illuminating. Most patients recovered at the same rate regardless of how much or how little I depleted them. Some recovered because their bodies healed themselves. Others declined because the corruption had progressed beyond any intervention's ability to reverse. The margin where our treatments actually made a difference was smaller than I had been taught to believe, and within that margin, less was often better than more. But try explaining this to a patient who had been bled by their grandfather's physician, their father's physician, and expected the same from theirs. Try explaining that the relief they felt after treatment might be simply the relief of ritual completed, of submission to authority, of having done something rather than nothing. Try explaining that the lightness they reported might be weakness mistaken for wellness. I could not, or rather I tried, and found that most patients did not wish to hear it. They wanted the certainty of established methods. They wanted the reassurance of treatment they recognized. They wanted to believe that medicine was a matter of precise interventions yielding predictable results, not the uncertain business of supporting the body's own attempts at recovery, while trying not to interfere too much with processes we barely understood. So I practiced a strange compromise. I treated as patients expected to be treated, but in reduced measure. I maintained the rituals while quietly undermining their foundations. I kept the leech jars, but drew from them less frequently. I kept the lancets sharp, but drew smaller quantities. I spoke of balance and depletion, but privately I no longer believed in the theories that gave those words their meaning. It was dishonest, perhaps. Or perhaps it was kindness. I could not decide which. The years passed. I married, though late, at 32, to a vicar's daughter who had the good sense never to fall ill seriously enough to require my professional attention. We had no children. Perhaps that was a mercy. I do not know what I would have done had I been required to treat my own son or daughter according to methods I had come to mistrust. The practice prospered in the modest way of provincial practices. I took on partners, younger men trained in the new methods, who looked at the leech jars with something like embarrassment. We spoke less of humours and plethora, more of inflammation and infection. We drew less, observed more, and quietly, incrementally let the old ways slip into the past. By 1860, bloodletting had become unusual rather than routine. The leech jars gathered dust. I donated most of our specimens to a teaching hospital where they would be displayed as curiosities, relics of an earlier age. A few I kept, unable to entirely abandon the creatures that had been my constant companions for so many years. I would sometimes open a jar and watch them in the cloudy water, these patient, mindless things that had once been instruments of healing. They had not changed. We had changed. Our understanding had changed. But the leeches remained what they had always been, creatures following their nature, feeding when opportunity presented itself, neither helpful nor harmful, but simply themselves. And I thought, we had projected so much upon them. We had made them agents of purification, tools of balance, living instruments of a cosmic order we wished to believe in. We had convinced ourselves that their feeding had meaning beyond simple hunger, that what they drew away was not just the warmth that sustained life, but the excess that threatened it. We had been wrong, not entirely, but profoundly, and the cost of that error had been measured in the pale faces of patients bled beyond recovery, in the quiet endings that might have been prevented, in the suffering we had called treatment because we lacked the courage or the wisdom to admit our ignorance. But we had also been human. We had tried to help with the knowledge we possessed. We had been sincere in our errors, dedicated in our misconceptions. We had stood at the bedside of suffering and done what we believed would relieve it, and if that belief was flawed, it was nevertheless motivated by something decent, something that might be called compassion even when the actions it prompted caused harm. Could I forgive us? Could I forgive Dr. Hardwick, who had taught me methods that had killed as often as they cured? Could I forgive myself for perpetuating those methods even after doubt had crept in? I did not know. Forgiveness seemed too simple for the complex guilt of sincere error, but I could understand. I could look back across decades of practice and see how easy it had been to believe, how compelling the theory had seemed, how the evidence had appeared to support our methods, because we had interpreted every outcome through the lens of our assumptions. I could see how tradition and authority, and the need to do something in the face of suffering, had combined to create a system of treatment that persisted long beyond any rational justification. And I could see how difficult it had been to change, how much courage it required to admit that centuries of practice might have been built upon faulty foundations, how threatening it was to abandon the certainties that made medicine feel like science rather than educated guesswork. The transition was not clean. It was not a moment of revelation where scales fell from eyes and truth stood revealed. It was gradual, messy, filled with compromises and half-measures, and physicians who changed their practice while clinging to the old explanations, who used new methods while speaking the old language, because language changes more slowly than understanding. Some of my colleagues never changed at all. They practiced bloodletting until they retired or died, and their patients mourned them as great physicians because the patients too had been raised in the old certainties and could not imagine medicine without the ritual of depletion. Others changed too enthusiastically, rejecting everything associated with the old methods and embracing new treatments with the same uncritical faith we had once given to leeches and lancets. They did not understand that the problem was not the specific methods, but the certainty itself, the belief that we understood the body well enough to intervene decisively in its workings. I tried to steer a middle course. I practiced with humility, admitting freely to patients that much remained unknown, that treatments were provisional and outcomes uncertain. Some patients found this honesty reassuring. Others sought practitioners who would speak with the old confidence, even if that confidence was unwarranted. I could not blame them. Uncertainty is difficult to bear, especially when the body is suffering and the mind is desperate for relief. We want to believe that someone knows, that expertise is real, that submission to treatment will yield predictable results. We want medicine to be certain because we need to believe that suffering has meaning and endings can be controlled, but medicine is not certain. It is an attempt, sometimes successful and sometimes not, to support the body's own attempts at healing, while minimizing the harm our interventions inevitably cause. It is trial and error dressed in professional language, observation refined through experience but never rising to the level of perfect knowledge. The leeches taught me this, in their way. They were such simple creatures, following such simple impulses. Feed when opportunity presents itself. Drink until full. Release when satisfied. There was no malice in them, no intention beyond survival. They were not agents of healing or harm, but merely neutral actors in dramas we constructed around them. We had made them into something they were not. We had given them powers they did not possess. We had believed in them because we needed to believe in something, because the alternative was admitting how little we truly understood, how vast the distance between theory and truth. And when we finally stopped believing, when the evidence became impossible to ignore and the new generation demanded change, the leeches did not vanish. They remained in their jars, in their ponds, in the wild streams where they had always lived. We were the ones who changed. We were the ones who learned, slowly and painfully, that our confidence had exceeded our competence, that our desire to help had led us into causing harm, that good intentions were not sufficient protection against error. I am 73 now, long retired from active practice. The surgery on Wentworth Street is occupied by a young physician who trained at the newer hospitals, who speaks of bacteria and antisepsis, who would be astonished to learn that, in my youth, we believed most illness stemmed from an excess of the very substance that carried life itself through the body. Sometimes I walk past and look at the brass plate, which still bears Dr. Hardwick's name above my own, though both of us are gone from the practice. I think about the patients who climbed those steps, who sat in that green waiting room, who lay upon that oak table while we applied our leeches and our lancets and our certainties. Some we helped, despite our errors. Some we harmed through our sincere mistakes. Most, I suspect, would have recovered or declined regardless of our intervention, their outcomes determined by forces we could observe but not control, by the body's own wisdom which operated according to laws we had not yet discovered. And I think about Miss Benson, whose trembling we bled away, and wonder what became of her. Did she marry? Did she find happiness? Or did we deplete not her plethora but her capacity for feeling itself, leaving her too tired to tremble, too weak to love or fear or hope with any intensity? I will never know. Her file, like so many others, contains only the medical facts. Treatments administered, fees collected, symptoms reported as resolved. The human story, the actual lived experience, is absent from our records, because we did not think to ask what treatment felt like from the inside, whether the relief we noted was genuine, or simply the patient's exhaustion with a process that could not be refused. This is what I have learned after 50 years of practice, that we must listen more carefully, intervene more cautiously, and hold our certainties more loosely than our profession has traditionally allowed. That patients are not merely vessels to be balanced, but persons with knowledge of their own experience that exceeds our theoretical understanding. That sometimes the best treatment is to do less rather than more, to support rather than direct, to observe rather than intervene, and that even when we are wrong, even when our methods cause harm, we are not thereby absolved, but neither are we entirely condemned. We are humans attempting to help other humans, working with incomplete knowledge and imperfect methods, doing our best with tools that future generations will look back upon with the same mixture of understanding and horror we now feel when we contemplate the leech jars and the bleeding bowls. The one jar I kept sits on a shelf in my study. The water is clear now, changed weekly, though there is no longer any need. The 3 leeches within are old, sluggish, past the age of feeding. I keep them not from sentiment, but as a reminder of how easily certainty becomes cruelty, how good intentions pave familiar roads, how the desire to help can become the cause of harm when we lack the humility to question whether we truly understand what we are doing. They curl against the glass, these patient creatures, and I watch them sometimes in the evening light. They are innocent. They were always innocent. We were the ones who made them instruments of a theory that could not bear examination, who convinced ourselves that their feeding was treatment rather than simply feeding. When they die, as they soon will, I will bury them in the garden with something like ceremony. They were my teachers in their way, though they never knew it. They taught me doubt. They taught me humility. They taught me that medicine is not the application of certainty, but the practice of careful uncertainty, and that the physician's first duty is not to trust in methods, but to attend to outcomes, however much those outcomes might challenge the methods we have learned to love. Would you have trusted a man who carried leeches in his pocket? Many did. They trusted us completely, submitted to our treatments without question, and we accepted that trust as our due because we believed we knew what we were doing. But trust is a responsibility more than a privilege, and we failed that responsibility more often than we knew. Not through malice, not through carelessness, but through the simple, terrible error of believing ourselves more certain than we had any right to be. The leeches drew what the basin gathered. The warmth that left the skin carried with it not just the excess we imagined, but sometimes the very substance needed for recovery. We called it treatment because we needed to call it something, because doing nothing felt like abandonment, because patients expected intervention, and we provided what was expected. But I wonder now, in these final years, how many recovered despite us rather than because of us? How many suffered because we were too confident in our understanding, too devoted to our methods, too afraid to admit that we did not know, could not know, and should have acted with the caution that such ignorance demanded? They said the red warmth held the soul's unrest, and we believed them. We believed that depletion could cure not just fevers of the body but fevers of the heart, that love itself could be bled away when it became inconvenient or inappropriate. We treated passion as pathology and called it medicine. Were we healers, or were we simply enforcers of a social order that required women to be calm, workers to be productive, the restless to be still? Did we serve health or conformity? Did we cure disease or merely suppress the symptoms of lives lived under constraint? These are questions my profession does not like to ask. But they must be asked, because the alternatives to asking are either arrogance or willful blindness, and both lead to harm however good our intentions. I have no grand conclusions. I have only these memories, these observations, these doubts that have accumulated over a lifetime of practice. I offer them not as condemnation but as testimony, as one man's account of how easily we can be wrong while believing ourselves right, how sincerely we can cause harm while thinking we offer help. The world has moved on. Medicine has moved on. The leech jars gather dust in museums now, displayed alongside bleeding bowls and scarificators as relics of a superseded understanding. Future generations will look at them and shake their heads at our primitive beliefs, just as we looked back at earlier centuries and wondered how they could have believed what they believed. And then those future generations will make their own errors, will believe with equal certainty in methods that later ages will find barbaric or absurd, will cause harm while pursuing healing, will look back eventually and wonder how they could have been so wrong. This is the human condition. This is the practice of medicine. We do our best with what we know, and what we know is always incomplete, and the gap between knowledge and certainty is where harm enters, quiet and confident and wearing the face of care. The leeches in my jar are nearly still now. Their movements have slowed to almost nothing. Soon they will achieve that final quiet, and I will bury them beneath the rosebush where they will return to the earth that made them. And I will sit in my study, an old man with too many memories, and I will think about all the patients I treated, and all the treatments I administered, and all the certainties I held that proved to be errors dressed in professional language. We thought the leech drew out illness. We thought we understood the body's needs better than the body itself. We thought our theories were truths, and our methods were justified, and our interventions were necessary. Perhaps we drew out only what we feared to feel. Perhaps we bled away not plethora but humanity itself, the mess and intensity of being alive, in a body that suffers and desires and resists the balance we tried to impose upon it. I do not know. I know only that I practiced medicine for 50 years, and that I helped some and harmed others, and that I spent the last 30 years of practice trying to undo the certainties of the first 20. That is the sum of my testimony. The leech jar sits on its shelf. The water is clear. The creatures within are dying as all things die, innocent of the meanings we projected upon them, innocent of the suffering they were made to witness and to cause. When love ached, they said, we bled the heart itself, and we believed them, because we needed to believe that pain could be drawn out like corruption, that suffering had a physical location that could be depleted, that the ache beneath the ribs could be measured in ounces and released into pewter bowls. But pain is not so simple. Love is not so simple. The human heart, that muscular organ that beats its steady rhythm beneath the breastbone, is not where heartbreak lives. We were bleeding the wrong thing, treating the wrong complaint, pursuing a mechanical solution to what was never a mechanical problem. And yet the patients thanked us. They felt lighter, they said, clearer, more balanced. The weight had lifted, they reported, and we accepted this as proof of successful treatment rather than evidence of how desperately people will believe in any ritual that offers relief from suffering, however temporary, however illusory. I think of them all now, those pale faces trusting us to know what they could not. I think of their gratitude and their suffering and the strange intersection of the two, where treatment became indistinguishable from ordeal, where the cure hurt as much as the disease but was borne with patience because we assured them it was necessary. Were we cruel, or were we simply wrong? Is there a difference when the outcome is the same? I leave these questions to those who come after, who will judge us, as we judge those who came before. I offer only this account, this testimony, of a life spent in service to methods I learned to doubt, but lacked the courage to entirely abandon. The leeches taught me patience. They taught me that hunger can be mistaken for purpose, that feeding can be mistaken for healing, that the simple act of drawing something out can be invested with meanings it does not possess. They were only leeches. We were the ones who made them into sacraments. And now, at the end of a long life spent in the practice of what I believed was medicine, I understand that we were always bleeding more than we intended, always drawing out more than we knew, always imposing our certainties upon bodies that knew better than we did what they needed, if only we had learned to listen. The jar on the shelf holds the last witnesses to an age that has passed. When they are gone, when I am gone, perhaps the profession will have learned the lessons we were too proud or too frightened to learn. That uncertainty is not weakness but wisdom, that doing less is sometimes better than doing more, that the patient's own understanding of their suffering matters more than our theoretical explanations, or perhaps not. Perhaps each generation must learn these lessons anew, must make its own mistakes, must believe its own certainties until experience teaches otherwise. The light is fading now. Evening has come to my study, as it comes to all things. The leeches in their jar are barely visible in the gathering dusk. Soon I will light the lamp, and their forms will become clear again, dark ribbons against the glass, patient and hungry and innocent of everything we made them mean. This is my testimony. This is what I witnessed. This is what I learned. Too late for those I harmed. Too late to undo the errors I committed in good faith. Too late for anything except this quiet accounting of how we practiced medicine when medicine was more faith than science, more ritual than understanding, more hope than knowledge. The world has changed. We have changed. But the leeches remain what they always were, creatures following their nature, neither good nor evil, neither healing nor harming, simply existing in the margins between our theories and our truths. And I remain what I have always been, a man who tried to help and often failed, who believed and then doubted, who practiced with certainty and ended in confusion, who spent a lifetime learning how little he truly knew. That is enough. It must be enough. It is all I have to offer. The jar on the shelf, the creatures within, the testimony of a life spent in their company. This is what remains when certainty fades, and the old methods are set aside, and we are left with only the question that has no answer. Did we help? Or did we simply do what we were taught to do, believing it was help because we could not bear to believe otherwise? I do not know. I will never know. And that not knowing is the final lesson, the one the leeches taught me without meaning to, the one I offer now to whoever reads these words. We thought we knew. We were certain, and our certainty was the greatest danger of all.